This podcast is a part of the Local Government Podcast Network, where we give local governments a voice.
Welcome to the Building Amazing Cities and Towns podcast, the podcast for mayors, council members, managers, staff, and anyone who is interested in building an amazing city. Your host is Jim Hunt, the author of Bottom Line Green, How American Cities Are Saving the Planet and Money Too, and his latest book, The Amazing City, 7 Steps to Creating an Amazing City. Jim is also the former president of the National League of Cities, 27-year mayor and council member, and 2006 Municipal Leader of the Year by American City and County Magazine. Today, Jim speaks to thousands of local government officials each year in the U.S. and abroad. Jim also consults with businesses who are bringing technology and innovation to local governments. Jim, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Matt. Happy to be here.
Well, I really appreciate you having me on as your co-host, and I'm curious, what made you decide to start this podcast?
Well, Matt, as I travel around the country and I've interacted with tons of local government officials, people keep asking where can I find more information? And I like the book, but I'd like to get a little deeper into it. And I started several months ago in this podcast world, and I started to connect the pieces. And I said, the podcast I think would be fantastic because it's topical, it's up to date. And that was my thought, is that I think the podcast is going to be an excellent communication tool to translate the 7 steps to creating an amazing city and to bringing new and innovative ideas for local government.
Yeah, it's such a growing media all across the country and the world, really. And I think it's a fantastic avenue to get the message out that people are really, really gravitating towards.
Yeah, and I've learned so much. And the interesting thing to me is that, the podcast, the format, you're able to get a little deeper than you do on, and you can respond to questions, and with the guests. And when I looked over my Rolodex and group of people that I talk with regularly, a lot of them I'm thinking, man alive, I need to share some of this with others because in local government, as we know, budgets are tight at times, and there's no sense in spending dollars and investing in ideas and so forth if others have already done it and we can learn from them.
Yeah, there's probably some conversations that you have that just recording the phone call you have with a longtime friend in the local government world would be tremendously valuable to many folks across the country. Absolutely.
And I think the other thing too is that hopefully we'll be able to introduce some non-traditional people into the conversation. And I have so many experiences as I get out and I walk into downtowns and talk to business owners and economic development people and so forth. And their insights are sometimes things that they wouldn't normally tell about their interactions with their local government members. And from my standpoint, since I'm not invested in that particular community, they will share with me ideas and things that I think are very interesting and reveal a lot about what would make a better community.
Yeah, absolutely. And you say in the introduction that the podcast is for mayors, council members, managers, staff, and anyone who's interested in building an amazing city. Tell me a little bit more about that community you see this podcast being for.
Well, I think a lot of times we traditionally look at that and just think that, in a community that it's the mayor and council members that run the city, city managers and the staff. So the interaction that people have, but they don't realize it's such a wider net that's out there. You have members of the Chamber of Commerce and the staff of the chambers across the country. And I've been increasingly speaking to more Chamber of Commerces, and I've found that it's an exciting place to be. Their goals in many cases are the same as local government, and that is to build an amazing city. When you look at all of the challenges that face downtowns across the United States, and it actually has even gone over now to where places where they've had traditional malls, they've had strip shopping centers and so forth, even those are having a challenge in different places across the country. And there are some innovative ways that local governments and businesses and chambers and economic development people have worked together to build truly amazing cities. And then the other thing, I think sometimes, the old adage that you can't fight City Hall, and there's literally millions of people out there that live in our communities across the country that at this stage have retired from careers and all, that they have this time and they want to invest in building their communities up. And I think one of the things with my experiences back from working in a lot of grassroots organizations such as Habitat for Humanity and leading a neighborhood revitalization corporation, I can tap into some of that energy that's out into the communities. And I think sometimes people wants to know, where is the line and what can I do without stepping on toes, et cetera. And I think we're going to get into a lot of that and talk to some community people who have turned out to be what I term spark plugs in their local community.
Yeah, I love the fact that you're looking forward to taking the conversation you have when you're out in Washington State or down in Texas or in your home state of West Virginia or wherever you are in the country or even internationally, and taking those gems that you glean from just a conversation over lunch or after a speaking event, and then sharing it with everybody so that information can maybe be put into place in their own government.
Oh, and I think, 2 years ago, I went over to Vienna, Austria, and Prague in the Czech Republic. And walking the streets in Prague, a beautiful city, a place that is just world acclaimed. I mean, just fantastic. But I picked up some tips that I've been sharing with local officials in the United States. And some of it is the fact that in Europe, a lot of the old historic cities have not gone through. They've had a little bit of the mall type development and that, but by and large, those the downtowns are still the downtowns, and have made it kind of successfully move forward without going through a lot of iterations. And looking at some of the ways that they've sustained their downtown redevelopment has really been enlightening for cities in the United States. And I've found that there's some ideas that I can bring, from the travels internationally that really are applicable now into the United States.
Yeah, it's a great opportunity to share that information and cross-pollinate from one area to another that maybe people hadn't been exposed to.
Absolutely.
So I know as we go through the podcast, you're going to be diving a lot deeper into your popular book, The Amazing City. But can you give us just a peek at the 7 steps? Give us a little taste of what's in there?
Yeah, and I think the one thing that when I speak around the country and talk to city officials and Chamber of Commerce's and all, and I always will tell them, I'll say, if you come up with another step that you think that I should have included, let me know what it is. And in many cases, they'll say, you know what, I think those 7 steps pretty well cover what we needed. And those come down, and it starts out with attitude. Attitude is one of the things that I tell people all the time, is that I've never been in what I consider an amazing city where they have a poor attitude. And when you go into a city, it's not just the person behind the desk at City Hall that has to have the good attitude. It really comes down to it that this goes out throughout the community. I was out in Oregon and talking to a group, and I asked them if they knew where I learned a lot about the community I was there. And they said that, they were kind of quizzically looking, and I said, the Uber driver driving in was telling me all the challenges that the city had. And they laughed, and I said, let me ask you something. Have you reached out to the Uber drivers and the taxi drivers in your community and maybe sponsored a little pizza party in the summer where everyone is invited to stop by and get a free pizza and interact with the mayor and the different departments in the city? And they said, no, we've never even given that a thought. And I said, well, given the fact that those are the first people that as visitors come into your community or even residents within the city are interacting with about the city, don't you think that they would be good ambassadors and their attitude would matter on how people views your city? And all of a sudden the light bulbs started going off. And that's the attitude aspect of it. The other, and it goes off the word amazing. The next one is M for motivation. The motivation of why people are interested in building an amazing city, I think, kind of depends on where you stand. And if you're a business, you're thinking, you know what, this could help my business. If you're a resident, you're thinking, I'd like to live in an amazing city where it's safe and clean and has all of the attributes and things for my children to do and a great place to grow up. The next day of amazing is attention to detail. And this is one where, you know, as a longtime city official, what irritated me the most as I was serving in elected office was driving down the street and seeing, let's say, a sign that was, you know, had been hit by a car and is leaning over and it's been there for months and no one had taken care of it. Or it's the person who had their garbage out in front of their store or their home and the dogs got into it and it was just strung all over and no one bothered to clean it up. Those are the things, the attention to detail are the difference between what's considered a very unruly town. It gives an image that it's just dangerous and all of the things that come into that. And a clean town, a clean streets and places that have graffiti has been taken care of and painted over and so forth. Those are the keys of attention to detail that makes a difference in a community. The Z in amazing stands for zing. And when I say this, a lot of times it's easier to describe it than it is to, you know, as you talk about it, to understand what zing is, but you know it when you see it. And I ask the question a lot of times in a city is that both large and small. So if we talk about, let's say, Paris, we say, what's the zing of Paris? What's the symbolic kind of the visual that you get? And most people will say the Eiffel Tower. Now, granted, there'll be other things that they may come up with that are just as valid, but the Eiffel Tower seems to be that zing in Paris. So when you go into cities that are much smaller, and we talk about, I use an example in my book of Olney, Illinois. And Olney is the home of the white squirrel. And you'd think that, you know, that's not much. I mean, you're thinking, well, how does that become a zing? Well, the officials there and the chamber and the citizens, they have these white squirrels that I've been there and they're not everywhere, but they're around and you'll see them. And they've put it on their logo. They put it on the police departments, has their patch on the side of their uniforms that have a white squirrel. The welcome to Olney, the home of the white squirrel. What they've done is taken something that is unique to that community, and they've explored it to say, how can we make this that if someone hears our city, they'll connect it with something and remember it. And I tell people all over the country, you'll never forget Olney, Illinois now, because if you drive by, you'll pull off the road to see it because of the white squirrels, and it just patches. So then we get into the amazing of I, and that's inclusiveness. And across the country today, I think inclusiveness is one of the key components of amazing cities. During my tenure as president of the National League of Cities, we built the Partnership for Inclusive Communities, which involved communities all over the country. Many are still participating in the effort, and that is to build inclusive communities. And it's been a tremendous program of the National League of Cities, but it's also helped to build cities and to attract businesses, to attract the citizens. And Richard Florida pointed out in his book when he was living in Pittsburgh, and he talked about the challenges that Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, had the ability to be the center of technology. It could have been the Silicon Valley of the United States because the schools there, Carnegie Mellon, University of Pittsburgh, they were producing some of the best technology people in the country. But what happened was that Pittsburgh had this kind of they don't have it anymore. They're truly bursting out, but they had this tendency that they were viewed as a kind of an old steel city, that were cultural, that if you weren't born there, if you didn't immigrate there back in the 1920s, you weren't a true Pittsburgher. And it hurt them from a standpoint of attracting and retaining talent. And I think what the inclusive nature of communities today, if you're going to bring people in, if you're going to have businesses that want to locate in your community, being inclusive as a component is something that's very necessary. When we get into the N of amazing, neighborhood empowerment, neighborhoods are where we all live. And one of the interesting things that I've found is coming from a small town, being in local government, and then interacting with people like Tony Williams, the former mayor of Washington, D.C., Joe Buscaino, a council member out in Los Angeles, Matt Zone, who wrote the foreword for my book, from Cleveland, Ohio. I always had the feeling that they did things differently because they were so big. That Joe Buscaino out as a council member in Los Angeles, it was a completely different job than what I was doing in my little town in West Virginia. But the interesting thing is that they do essentially the same thing on a larger scale. They interact with their citizens. They clean up the alleyways. They have a problem with graffiti and all the certain things that we have in smaller towns. And many of the strategies that work in small towns work in large cities and vice versa. And I'm going to have some guests in the future that I think will point that out, that we're not so different when we look at these different levels. And living in a community, a neighborhood in Los Angeles is not much different in many cases than living in a neighborhood in Iowa or Nebraska or other places. Then the G in amazing stands for green awareness. And one of the things that I've worked and I've consulted with a lot of energy companies on transitioning into these innovative technologies like LED lighting, that if your city is not looking at green awareness, it's pretty difficult then to have the funding and to be able to go into the future because it's so expensive today. And what we've done across the country, and I've worked with many cities that have saved unbelievable amounts of money, millions of dollars, by switching over to things like LED street lighting or redoing their parks and their city hall buildings where they've saved hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. So that gives you kind of the broad spectrum of amazing and what it takes to be an amazing city.
Well, I can tell you that there's a lot of people listening right now that can't wait to dive into the details of the 7 podcasts that will be coming as you dive in. Those are some pretty interesting topics, and I can tell that you have a lot of stories that are going to illustrate them very well.
Absolutely, and I think that the interesting thing is that it does cover the gamut of cities, and it covers. A lot of times I think, and this has been one of my things over the years that I'll talk with people about, is that people will go, let's say, to a vacation area. They'll go to the beach. They'll go to Orlando for Disney World and all. And then they come home to their communities and they're thinking that, geez, our community needs, this or that. And sometimes we don't realize that that's not necessarily. We go to those places. We go, when you go to the beach, you expect that there's going to be the vendors selling T-shirts and the boardwalks and things like that. Now, there are some things in that can be applicable to where you come from. But a lot of times we have unrealistic goals in our communities where we're not doing some of the little things that will make the quality of life better. But the nice thing, I think, and the other thing that a lot of times people don't see too, is they'll go to these wonderful places and they think, boy, I had the greatest vacation. But if you talk to people that live there every day, sometimes their quality of life is impacted by all these visitors coming.
Right.
And they love to see the visitors leave because then they have this quality of life that increases. So sometimes it's understanding the dynamics in communities and who's benefiting. If you have a community that's totally kind of in this mode of entertainment of guests and of visitors and so forth, a lot of college towns. And I worked in a college town. I've spoke to the International Town Gown Association several times. The nature of university communities, it is a fantastic thing to have a university in your community, but it brings a whole lot of challenges and opportunities that other communities don't have. And we'll dive into that a little deeper and talk to some of my friends across the country that live in these communities and lead these communities. And you'll see some of how they view in their communities what we might view as, boy, we'd love to have 50,000 people coming on a Saturday for a football game. But what it takes for that community to prepare and manage that, and how they keep their citizens happy by entertaining these 50 and 60, and in the case of Penn State and Ohio State, 100,000 people coming in on a weekend. How do they do this and still maintain a quality of life for their citizens? And I think those conversations, you're going to be talking to people from Arlington, Texas, where the AT&T Dome, and Sherry Capart's a member of City Council in Arlington, and arranged a tour for me to see the inner workings of the AT&T Dome and how the city participated in investing in that seventh wonder or eighth wonder of the world. But these are the type of people that we're going to be talking to and going behind the scenes on some of the things that you only see from the television maybe in the future.
Yeah, get some inside access to people that you likely wouldn't have otherwise. So, Jim, how did you get started in local government? You've got the books and the speaking now, but where did you get your start?
Well, back in the early 80s, I was approached, and I was in business, and some people approached me and asked me if I'd be interested in running for city council in my town. And I hadn't really thought about it that much, but my dad had worked in the public works department in our city. And I saw a side of the city in that I saw his work and the efforts that he made, and how he was someone who, in his position, working as a heavy equipment operator in the public works department, of how he was making a difference in the city. He would come home and tell stories of how they were repaving a certain section of town and how much it was improving things, and that they were working uptown because there was going to be a festival and they had to do some working on the streets to make it, in first class shape. And so that kind of piqued my interest in local government. But then I got involved with other things, went to college and so forth, and kind of lost that aspect of it. But then when I went into business and I started seeing that, I really took an interest then of thinking about running. And I joke with people that it took a while for the voters to warm up to me. I ran 2 different times, and the voters just didn't get me, and I wasn't elected. So persistence being the better part of that, I ran on the 3rd time and was elected, and started a career that lasted 27 years. Served as mayor and city council member, was involved in my state league, the municipal league, and became president of the state municipal league. Moved on and was interested and involved in the national league of cities. And I had no clue that this little guy from West Virginia was going to be the first person from West Virginia ever to serve as an officer of the National League of Cities. But I stuck around and worked hard, and was just honored to serve in 2005 as the president of the National League of Cities, and then went on from there to serve on the World Council of the National League of Cities, if you will, and got to travel all over the world, in South Korea, in Africa, in Istanbul, Turkey, and just an unbelievable opportunity to see local government and meet with mayors and council members and officials all over the world talking about building amazing cities. And then after that career, it was like I thought, well, I know nothing more. That's the most information I have is on cities and local government and how to build things. And that's when I started working on the book, and then was speaking around the country and then working for several companies that are doing innovation and in kind of forming what the next group of cities, what the next innovations are going to be coming in America's cities.
So you made the step from local government, like you said, small town West Virginia, to being the president of the National League of Cities. That had to be a big awakening for you, that you thought what happened in LA was way different than what was happening in West Virginia. Did that open your eyes a little bit?
Yeah, it really did. And one of the thrills of my life was the person who was directly ahead of me in they call it going into the chairs, who was, when I was second vice president of the National League of Cities, he was first vice president. That was Tony Williams, the former mayor of Washington, D.C. And I got to spend just hours and hours and hours with Tony. And the difference, it was interesting because Tony had a full security detail, that everywhere he went, there was police officers and plainclothes people. And if we were in Florida at a meeting, he would have his security detail. He also had a chief of staff, and everywhere he went, they were sending him notes and giving him a schedule and so forth. But like I say, they were dealing with the exact type of problems that I was dealing with at that point, only I had no staff and no security detail. So it was interesting that the mayor of Washington, D.C. Preceded me in the presidency of the National League of Cities. And my second vice president at that point was Bart Peterson, who was mayor of Indianapolis, Indiana. And the same thing, the scale was so much different when you looked at it. But when we would sit around the table and talk about the issues facing the membership of the National League of Cities, many times they would turn to me and say, Jim, what's your thought about it? Because there's a lot more cities of your size than there are Washington, D.C.'s and Indianapolis's. And I learned at that point that every city has a contribution, and we cannot kind of look at only the big cities, because that's what generally happens is everyone looks at it, well, what happens in New York City and Chicago and LA, that everyone else is what they call flyover country. And I've learned over my career that the real innovations that are happening in government, the laboratories of innovation and technology, are by and large happening in the small to mid-sized cities. And then it will go on up to the larger cities. But very seldom, but there are things that happen in the larger cities that work their way down. But more often than not, these ideas start in a smaller scale and work their way up to the big cities. So we become, and I tell people, it's the greatest laboratory in the world, because a small town can do, let's say, an energy efficiency project. When it works in a small town in America, what that means for larger cities is huge dividends. And without those laboratories looking at what works, you look at water quality, you look at what happened in Flint, Michigan, the solutions of that are they're difficult, but they're going to be found in the smaller communities and the mid-sized communities across the country. And that's what I'm excited to do, is to go to places that have solved these problems, homelessness, drug addiction, and all. There are cities today doing some innovative work that will solve this. And when that happens, it's going to change Los Angeles. It's going to change Seattle for their problems and issues with homelessness. But the solutions are going to come from a lot of people working together across the country of all sizes of cities. And I'm excited to be a part of it. And I think the one benefit that I've found with my experience is that you can pretty much connect that network together. And I think when that happens, we become a huge asset to the cities across the United States.
Yeah, it's the experience and the breadth of your network, the people that you know and the ideas that you've come across, I think is one reason why the books have been so popular. And I can only imagine that this podcast will follow in the same steps of popularity. So where do you see the podcast going with your background, with the books, with the other consulting work that you do? Where do you see the podcast going down the line?
Well, and I'm excited because I think the first thing we're going to do is dive deeper into the 7 steps. And we're going to talk about attitude. We're going to put specific examples behind that. We're going to talk about inclusiveness in areas like Selma, Alabama, where I've worked, and what can be done in communities that have had challenges in, civil rights and so forth. So we're going to have the ability to dive deeper into the 7 steps to give a good basis for what the podcast will then go in and start going across the United States and the world, talking to city leaders, people. A good friend of mine, Lee Feldman, was just appointed as city manager of Gainesville, Florida. And Lee was the president of the International City Managers Association when he was city manager in Fort Lauderdale. And having people like Lee and other folks, a good friend of mine, Mike Condiff, who co-wrote Bottom Line Green with me. Mike it does work all over the country with city councils and does retreats, and he works. So we're going to have some guests on in the future that will give you an insight. Another person who has done just tremendous work, Doug Eccles, from the former mayor of Rock Hill, South Carolina. Doug's had a 25-year career down in Rock Hill. And his story of the revitalization of Rock Hill will be something that every city will want to listen to, because they went from a very challenged downtown with the textile industry going off to overseas and literally walking down streets where there were weeds growing up in the parking lots and empty brick building, the old textile mills, to now becoming one of the unbelievable, amazing cities in this country where they've revitalized their economy and they've put in this BMX bicycle track that is attracting worldwide attention and having people come in from all over the world. These are the people who, when they go through their story, you're going to learn the backdrop of this. You're going to learn some of the challenges. You're going to learn where they made key decisions that made the difference. And I know that Doug Eccles' story will just resonate with so many local officials and local economic development people, because that story is one that is literally just unbelievable what they've been able to do in Rock Hill. So I'm excited. I mean, the steps ahead are so exciting that I just can't wait till we get into those and meet some amazing people.
Yeah, I thought getting into the 7 steps was going to be exciting, but the guests that you have access to and that you have slated, I think are going to be even better. So what about for Jim Hunt? What's next for you?
Well, I continue to speak. In fact, I'm heading up to New Hampshire to speak to the annual conference of the New Hampshire Municipal Association. This keeps me grounded. And the nice thing that I find in interacting with thousands of local officials each year is learning what's working and what's not. And if I were a fisherman or something else, or golfer, it would be like getting the latest golf driver and exploring how it improves your game by 3% or whatever. But I find when I'm traveling around, I learn so much of what's happening in one of the most, and here's another aspect of that. You know, when we look at the future, a lot of the technology that we've done, and now we can do so much on our phones. We can, most of the things when you go into the old downtowns, when you look at the different stores and so forth, what they're selling have all been combined into this little technology piece that you hold into your hand. And the thing that I like about cities is that as more and more people move to cities, that is where people are living. And we have to come up with what is the reason? How do we get people into these cities to have a great quality of life? And I think that the future, as we look forward in cities, is going to be dynamic. You're going to see things in cities and downtowns that you don't necessarily see today everywhere, but you're going to see that cities become these dynamic places where people will congregate with their children. There'll be parks and unique. I think the future of libraries in America are fantastic if they adapt to what their citizens need. But these are the things that are happening that are exciting. And I think probably if I had to pick, I think for young people, if you needed to pick a place where you could make the biggest difference, I think in getting involved in some aspect of local government, getting involved in building amazing cities is something that's just going to be fantastic.
Well, that is great, Jim. So where can listeners find more information on you, on your books, and ultimately how to build an amazing city?
Yes, and the Amazing Cities website is amazingcities.org. You can go there and find more information on where I'll be speaking and buying the book and exploring a little bit more about Amazing Cities. And also, I'm going to be offering for people who will visit and join our mailing list the 10 steps to revitalize your downtown. It's a free white paper that is going to explore a little deeper into easy things. I'm a proponent that there's always expensive solutions to every problem, but we have such an opportunity to do some of the things that are not costly, they're not prohibitive, that you can do tomorrow to make your downtown more inviting and more appealing to today's consumers. So I think that's going to be interesting, but please feel free to join our mailing list and subscribe to the podcast, and we're going to be doing some exciting things.
Yeah, so this has been a fantastic episode and really exciting about what will be coming in the future. So you can go for that free resource, 10 Steps to Revitalize Your Downtown. Just go to www.amazingcities.org. You can also get the book. Is the book available on Amazon?
Yes, it's available on Amazon. Just went into the second printing, so I'm excited. The people have really reached out. We've sold books in every state. We've sold many internationally. It's being used in graduate courses around the country as a resource for community development. So I couldn't be more thrilled with what's happened with the Amazing City.
That's fantastic. And if you're interested in a speaker for an upcoming event, how can they get in touch with you about that and check to see even if your schedule would allow it, as busy as you are?
They can visit the website or they can call me directly. I'll put the number in the show notes and would love to. One thing I enjoy probably as much as anything is speaking to groups and interacting and getting to travel around and see the various cities around this country. But just my cell phone number is on the show notes or visiting the website.
Very good. Well, we will see you on the next episode of the Amazing Cities and Towns podcast. Any last words that you have, Jim?
Just excited to start this adventure. And Matt, I really appreciate your co-hosting with me. And I'm sure as we go into other episodes, people will learn a little bit about you too and how in working together that we're going to build a great podcast.
Very good. Well, thank you, Jim. And here's to building your amazing city.
This has been the Amazing Cities Podcast, a production of the Local Government Podcast Network, your choice for local government podcasting. For more information on services of the Local Government Podcast Network, please visit www.localgovpodcasts.com. This has been the Amazing Cities Podcast, a production of the Local Government Podcast Network, your choice for local government podcasting. For more information on services of the Local Government Podcast Network, please visit www.localgovpodcasts.com.